Okay. All right, we are going to get started because there was excitement after the service. Yay! Woo! I like the energy back there. And maybe, do you think we can close those doors back there? I just want people to be able to hear. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate that. Thank you, Nate. All right. Okay, y'all were in worship, right? Yeah. I mean, seriously. Okay, so, and Ben had even asked me prior to the worship service, are you gonna say my bio and do that whole kind of thing? And I was like, no, I kind of just like effusively overwhelm people with my affection. And so that's my MO, because I believe that you all are capable of like Googling his bio and doing all of that stuff. So I will say, if you haven't read Ben's book, it is one of the most challenging, yet useful, yet hopeful books I have read, maybe period. Every time I write in the margin a question, because it'll bring up something for me, where I'm like, oh, people are very good at saying the really profound thing and leading all these questions. So I'll write it in the margin, and 2 pages later, he'll answer the question and give a very either something applicable or just something honest. And again, to those of you who have read this book, you'll know what really stood out to me is the graciousness and the vulnerability in which you put yourself out there, right? So I'm reading this book, and you're talking about how in spaces you as a black man have held more power or station than a woman, and how you've seen women othered, or in all of these various things. So it wasn't just from one place. You yourself move in the story. It's a dynamic story, and so thank you for the way that you invite us so generously into this conversation. Okay, so troubling the water, the urgent work of radical belonging. Now, it could have been the urgent work of radical justice, radical peace, radical love, fill in the blank. What was the journey to that particular word?
I would say probably for me, the journey to belonging was, it started off justice for me. It started off peace. But then I started asking myself a different question. Where do I want to be at the end of the journey? Is it that I just want justice juxtaposed to what's not made right? Do I just want peace because there's conflict? And I think where I landed was, no, what I want and what I think we need is belonging, which for me is about there being room for everyone to thrive and have agency. And that had, for me, what made it radical is it had to include the people that I disagree with. So justice for me was about getting things right for the people who were most like me. Peace was still a part of, okay, how do we make sure that we have a sense of rest, tranquility, but still for people that were like me. Belonging was what made me take the next step, which was, if I'm going to lean into radical belonging, then there is space for the people who are like me, but also for the folks who aren't, and that I am and they are learning how to actually be in a creative tension with each other.
You're such an amazing storyteller. So by the time, I actually first met in person Ben, 2 hours ago, and his wife, Janelle, and I felt like I was like, tell me about your daughters, how are they doing? I felt like I knew them because I've read this book now, and it's like so marked up. And so a story that I'm interested in hearing is about a time where you felt excluded. Because oftentimes that becomes the most informative experience for us in terms of wanting belonging, because we've experienced the opposite of that.
I think a little bit of my story was that, I was pastoring in church, and I joke in some spaces because I say, what I wanted for my life was to be a very shiny, successful, famous preacher and nice shiny suit and pastor a big church and all of those things that are part of that journey. But, in 2006 when we had 148 murders in Oakland, so that meant there was a murder happening every other day. And we also had over 500 shootings that year.
Yeah. So
we were per capita actually more dangerous than Chicago, which I know sometimes kind of become code language. It's like Chicago, this place, Detroit, right? But the Bay Area was really in a challenging moment. So it was at that moment where I shifted out of pastoring and went into trying to do community work. And, there's more story in the book around that because, I didn't really just shift out. I was kind of invited out, because they were like, stop talking about all this community stuff. But I think when I first started feeling exclusion was when I got into community life because I really wanted to try to bring some change. And yet I had to recognize that me showing up into the lives of others with all the best intentions did not mean that I was welcomed.
Yeah.
And I had to get comfortable over time knowing that I was bringing best intentions and at the same time being met with people who were suspicious of my intentions. And it was difficult for me, particularly because I am coming from a background of experiencing exclusion in this country as a black person, being racially profiled my whole life, just having a lot of, I grew up in an all-white Christian fundamentalist school in San Francisco. Now, figure those things out, but I grew up in that environment being, the only black kid in majority of my classes, having the Christian school take sample pictures of me at 13 years old and publish them in the yearbook, only to have my father come down there and do the angry black man shtick because he was mad about what was happening. So I experienced all of those, expressions of exclusion, but then I had to learn how to recognize that when I was trying to engage with others, my story was not going to immediately be seen. And so when I tried to do the bridging work with young men who were shooting in Oakland,
right.
They were excluding me. They didn't want me to, they were suspicious of why I was showing up. My blackness didn't make us the same. My verbiage didn't make us the same. We had very different experiences, even though we shared ethnic ancestry and melanin and a lot of other experiences. And so I just had to learn that if I was going to do this work, I could not step into other people's lives, even with the best intentions, and assume that they were going to receive me a certain way. I had to actually earn the right to be in relationship with people across difference.
I mean, that just, my initial response anytime I kind of experience exclusion or rejection is to push straight back, is to protect myself, right? Like, you're not breaking up with me, I'm breaking up with you, right? Like that kind of energy. I will reject you before you fully and totally reject me. Okay, so again, like I said, 400 questions that it just all depended on what he was gonna say, that the direction was gonna go. So y'all gotta bear with me, like I'm so excited to be in conversation with this person right now. What makes a person able to withstand, because in here you talk about how it is not always going to be easy. You are not always going to be received. You're going to hear hard things. So there is a stamina and a resilience to this work, even beyond the courage of just showing up, right? So like over and over again, from in the praxis of when you're actually doing the work, it is going to turn out tough. So what are the kind of things that strengthened your sense of self that you were able to say, okay, I'm seeing that and I'm feeling it and I'm still going to be here tomorrow and the next day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think I'm tracking with you. I would say, one, we have to really be sober with ourselves around the challenge that we are confronting, right? That the problems that we have in our world right now are not 15 years old, they're not 25 years old. They are calcified, codified, deeply rooted in our world. And so when we show up to them with the expectation that we can microwave the result and get to a quick solution so that it alleviates our stress, it's just not going to happen. And I think we actually set ourselves up for failure when we do it, because we come in with an expectation that, we're going to resolve this with a conversation or a set of conversations, instead of recognizing that we're actually building a cathedral. And I'm not sure where I am in that architectural plan. I might be laying the foundation. I might be stacking up a beam. I may never get to step into the full version of this thing that I'm working on. The question is, am I willing to contribute and manage my expectations, right? So when I think about where I am in the story right now, I think about us sitting in a room as a diverse, multiracial group of people. We only get to do that because people were laying beams 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago. Some of them couldn't even see this day.
Right.
So then we're thinking about the problems we have. To me, it's about imagination. Okay, what does it mean for me to continue to be faithful, do what it is that I'm doing, but manage my expectations? And then also recognize that just because I am doing good doesn't mean I'm going to be treated good, right? So when I was doing the work with bridging with police officers, when I first came in the room to do, a training with them, it was right in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement. Michael Brown had just been killed. They were protesting in Ferguson. And so I had to ask myself a question. I remember driving down from the South Bay from a meeting, and I said to myself, do I just go off on the police, or do I do the training? So that was the question I had to ask myself. Who am I going to be come in this moment, right? So I decided, okay, I'm going to show up as my best self instead of just go in, do my shtick, and be mad and have a cathartic release, and then they just go and keep doing what they're doing, but I feel better,
Right.
So I went in, I did it, and when I did it, I was met with a horrible response. So here I'm driving down 880. I come, I make this decision to show up well.
Yeah.
And then the way that they responded did not affirm the fact that I made the choice to show up well. So, of course, my thing is like, well, I'm not going to show up anymore, because I tried and that's it. And I went home and I talked to Janelle, and I was like, the police were training. As soon as I got up, you can even hear it in my voice. I'm like crying, moaning and complaining and whining. They got a bad attitude with me and so on and so forth. And she was like, well, what did they say? I said, they said, you don't know what it feels like to walk in our shoes. So we'll let you community people come in. You can say what you want, but you don't know what it feels like to walk in our shoes. And then Janelle said, well, why don't you start with that tomorrow? Because I had another training the next day, and I was contemplating whether I was going to go back, because I was like, I wasn't received, I wasn't treated right, et cetera. And she said, start with that. So I came in, and I brought my Air Force Ones with me that were sitting right by the door as I'm leaving out. I come in, and when I start off with the police, I walk in the room, they're all sitting there stoic, and I lift up my shoes, and I say, shoes. I don't know what it feels like to walk in your shoes. I don't know what it feels like to take the risks you take on a daily basis. I don't know what it feels like have to kiss the people you love, knowing you may never see them again. I don't know what it feels like to walk in your shoes. I only know what it feels like to walk in these shoes. My hope is over the next 2 hours I can talk to you about these shoes, and you'll trust me to talk to me about your shoes, and we'll figure out how to get your shoes and my shoes on the journey we can walk through. And in that moment, it broke open. And that led to 4 or 5 years of doing police trainings with police departments all across the country, police chiefs, all this. But it came because I had to manage my expectations. It also came because I listened to my wife. But I think it was the reality that just because you make a decision towards the right way doesn't mean it's going to go right. And if we really want to commit to radical belonging, that means we got to keep showing up, and we got to figure out how to do this work in community.
By the way, I just love that everyone clapped at that section. Just like right there, it was immediate. Hope you felt that love. Gosh, it's so challenging. And we were just talking in the chapel before this. He barely had a chance to get a sip of water when I was already starting to bombard him with questions about how the nature of the work right now, a lot of times, and particularly spaces with people of color, I feel deficient in the amount of anger that I personally hold. I'm seeing some heads nodding, so it's like I'm not angry enough. And so in this whole holding the shoes up, there's like I've witnessed so many spaces where it's a standstill. I'm not going to listen to you until you listen to me, or my people haven't been like there's. It's like the oppression Olympics. You name it here, and you even talking about your work with the police department it's like people are so locked, waiting for someone else to make the grand gesture. And even within the church, right? So like, whether it is, well, my generation never gets listened to, your generation, the people of my color, my gender, my experience, my sexuality, all of these things, at every turn we get locked in the same place, the same cycle. So what are some places or ways that you've seen that cycle broken?
So the practice for me, and I know I unpacked it a little bit in the book, but the practice for me is to recognize that I'm not one thing.
Yeah.
And neither is anyone else. And so there are times that I have to recognize where I have power and privilege in scenarios. And in those spaces, I actually need to be in the space of giving up power and privilege. I need to be listening more. I need to be willing to, as we used to say on the block, get chin checked. Not literally hit, but, just kind of, smell the smelling salt a little bit. I have to do that. Then there are other times where I experience persecution, prevention, subordination, and I should be speaking up and pushing back and trying to call folks in. I've tried in my work, and I've been to different places along the journey versus the call out and the call in. And what's hard in talking about it is what I don't want to do is to somehow demonize the important work of prophetic witness that sometimes is very disruptive. Like John the Baptist wearing camel skin, screaming at the Pharisees was very disruptive, right? But it played a role in the story. But what I'm trying to invite myself and invite us to recognize is we don't have to be one-trick ponies in the sense that the only way that I relate to what's wrong in the world is one way, right? I recognize people are different things, so there's going to be moments where, well, let me say it this way, because I know what it feels like to have power and privilege, and I know what it feels like to experience subordination, then there's moments where when I'm engaging somebody who in that scenario, they have power and privilege, I can also not just tap into my anger, but also tap into my empathy.
Having been there.
Having been there, right? And so, I have to recognize like, okay, this person might be engaging with me just because they are wanting to other me, be racist, be, hegemonic, or whatever different things. Or this person also could really be operating from a major blind spot, obstruction spot. And the benefit of decades of privilege. So can I pause for a moment and have some empathy if I really believe that that's going to serve us getting to a wider circle of human concern? And that's why I think the work of belonging is actually the work of becoming. Because if we're going to, unless we're all going to just kill each other, that means we're going to live with each other.
Right.
So we got to figure out how to do that. And, there's an image that has always inspired me, which is if I put enough, like let's say I take a ball of paper and I squeeze it in my hand. If I apply enough pressure, that paper will take on the form of my squeezed hand. But as soon as I let go of it, it starts to expand back to where it was because it didn't actually change. I just put pressure on it to change it. Versus like a butterfly, when that caterpillar goes through that, what is that process? Is it chrysalis?
Oh, yeah.
Chrysalis. When the caterpillar goes through chrysalis, it becomes a butterfly. It can never go back to being a caterpillar.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the work that we've got to do is the slow work of change. And I think a part of that for us is just thinking about, how can we show up with empathy, show up with your anger, but it doesn't have to be the only way that we relate to what's wrong around us and wrong in people.
Yeah. In your book, you, for me at least, reclaim so much language where this conversation gets shut down the second certain words are being brought up. And then they get co-opted by various sides. Oh, like how woke is now the word that is being touted as this horrible thing on one side, or it's the goal on the other side. And words that the second it's, for example, brought into a sermon, it doesn't matter what the surrounding sentences are. If that phrase is used, all of a sudden it will open up or unleash all the things that are attached to it. So I so appreciate the way you reclaim language. So can you define for us the P's, and then also walk us through that in relation to the A's. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you haven't read it, even more so, you're going to want to buy the book after this.
So the 4 P's that we, kind of look at in the book is really this framework that we're inviting people to use to try to understand how we can show up in relationship to people across difference. And the quadrant's not a panacea, but I just think it's a helpful framework. And it has 4 P's. So the first one is the powerful. These are normally the people in any given scenario who set the conditions for how things go. Then you have the privileged. The privileged, while they don't set the conditions for how things go, they usually benefit from the status quo. And then you have the persecuted, who sometimes have agency to shape how things will go, but for other times that aren't always obvious, they experience restriction where they don't have agency to shape how things go. And then you have the prevented, who usually by nature of just who they are in the world or in a scenario, they have no agency for how things go. So I think about myself as the person sitting in front of you. If we think about race in this country, I would locate myself in the prevented quadrant, being a part of a group of people who this country was not designed with us in mind in terms of thriving and belonging. But if we're going to talk about gender, I move from the prevented quadrant up to the privileged quadrant, because I benefit from the patriarchy that comes from a male-dominated system. And then if you talk about the company that Janelle and I started, I move into the powerful because we raised the capital and got the company off the ground. So in one body, depending on the scenario, I'm the powerful, the privileged, or the prevented. And so I think the challenge is recognizing that when we come into space with each other, we have to ask, not just who am I, but who am I in this scenario? Because that'll help me also understand how I'm being seen and experienced. And there's also invitation for me to recognize, hey, if we're having a conversation about race, how do I show up there? But if I'm in the place where we work, right, for example, I have to hold that I actually don't know the truth about what's happening in our organization. The people who have the least amount of agency do. And that's hard for me to hold, because I'm like, I know everything that's happening in my organization.
Say more about that, please.
Yeah, I'm the boss. I know what's happening, And I have to hold the fact that people that are colleagues, our contractors that are on the team, one of the things talked about, Glenn Martin from New York says that the people who are closest to a problem are closest to the solution. But they're the furthest from the resources and power. I'll say that again. Yeah. The people who are closest to a problem are actually closest to the solution, but they are the furthest usually from resources and power. So what ends up happening is the people who are experiencing the problem are telling the people who set the conditions for how the problem is thriving, or the people who benefit from the status quo, this is what's happening. But those same people go, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Or let me tell you why it's happening.
Right.
Or let me tell you what you should do. Instead of taking the posture to say, really, I didn't know that. Can you say more about that? And how can I recognize, as a person with more power and more privilege, how do I take now a different position in the story? That doesn't mean giving up my role, but it does mean that I begin to share agency. And I say, okay, well, in order for us to fix this problem, I obviously didn't know it was happening, don't know what it feels like to experience it, but you do, so now we're going to co-create.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to share the agency that the story has given me with you, and I'm even willing to follow you as you lead us to the solution, because you're the only person that can tell me whether the problem has in fact been solved. Now, so that's a long journey to go, right? That's where the 5 A's come in. So we tried to unpack, how does a person move through this journey? Because, it's not natural. So there's 5 A's that we use to chart your formation. The first A is awareness. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get aware of where people are experiencing persecution and prevention. But then the second A is accountability. Accountability is where I then ask myself, how have I been complicit in how other people have been experiencing this subordination and marginalization. Then the third A is articulation. I have to learn how to talk about the problem the way that the person who's experiencing the problem would talk about it, not the way I would talk about it, right? So for example, as a male, if I'm gonna do something about sexism and patriarchy, I can't talk about it the way myself as a man who grew up in a very patriarchal space would talk about it. I gotta learn how to talk about it the way that a woman would talk about it who's experienced sexism and patriarchy. The fourth A is advocacy. Now I begin to actually take action and put skin in the game in ways in which I could actually experience some pain and some challenge. So I begin to show up, speak out. If I'm in rooms, I'm speaking up for those that are experiencing prevention and persecution the way that they would talk about it. I'm risking myself. And then the fifth A is activation. Now I'm ready to go invite others to say, this is what we need to start doing about this problem. My concern is we've been going from awareness to activation. I found out about something. I read a book. I read How to Be an Anti-Racist. I read How to Do such and such. You know, I saw this documentary. And then we start telling everybody, this is how you need to talk. This is what you need to do. But we have not gone through our own process. So if I talk about it as it relates to, say, sexual orientation, as a straight man that grew up in a society that did not have a lot of range for LGBTQ plus folks, I had to go on my journey of becoming more aware of what it meant to experience the way that the world looks like. Doesn't mean that that has to be my experience. I had to also be accountable for the ways that as an adolescent, as a young adult, I made the world less safe for LGBTQ plus people. Not because I was consciously trying, but I did. Then I had to learn how to really start talking about the things that LGBTQ plus folks are concerned about in the world and learn how to represent their interests where they were not invited. With advocacy, I had to learn also how to say, let's make room. And instead of talking to the straight guy about how the LGBTQ plus folks are experiencing life, why don't we create space and let them speak for themselves? Amen. Why don't we change the meeting? And if that means some of us are uncomfortable because whatever space this is, you'll be all right. I promise. You'll be alive when it's over. Nobody's going to do nothing to you. Then it was only at that point that I could go around and start inviting others to think about it, because I had been through my own journey. And I just think in the ways in which othering shows up in our world, if we got on that practice, we'll recognize that none of us have arrived. We're constantly forming, learning about what's happening in our world, and we should just stay on that ongoing journey. So it's less about I figured it out, because I don't know if anybody's gonna figure out this American experiment, but we can be faithful in the middle of it and hopefully make it better.
Okay, I'm just like, so good. We're good learners. This is a very good learning community. We are proximate to a community that is centered around learning. There is beautiful value to learning. And we saw this also, this is not a 5-year problem, 10-year problem, 50, 100, but in the recent manifestation of this after George Floyd's murder, every church got a book and started a book group and started doing the learning. And then it kind of, churches around the world, and particularly in this country, hit a wall of like, so do we find a second book and a third book? And now what do we do? What do we do? And so in the forming, what are ways in which our natural proclivity to learn and experience and do can shift out to forming? Yeah,
so I think knowledge is good, but knowledge without practice is not good. And I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to have small, accessible practices that become a part of our daily lives and rituals, right? So one of the main practices, and actually it was here at First Press almost a decade ago that I remember starting to say this a lot, was we need to close our proximity to people's pain, right? Close your proximity. Get closer to people's pain. So one of the practices around that I've invited folks into is in whatever form of othering that you're becoming aware of, that you want to, contribute to there being more belonging. That could be race, could be gender, could be sexual orientation, could be class, could be a variety of different ways that people experience othering. How do you begin to show up in the places where those people who are being othered, gather to talk about their problems, to organize around their problems, to do work with each other to change their conditions, and show up to that place as a learner, not a leader, as a practice. And what I tell folks is, it could be a weekly meeting. It could be a bi-weekly meeting. Maybe it's a monthly meeting. You show up there regularly, recognizing that 70 to 80% of what's said there or how the meeting is facilitated will likely disrupt you. You'll sit there and go, they shouldn't be doing the meeting this way, or this is not the right way to solve a problem, or because really what's happening is you're exercising all of your control demons is really what's happening, right? I need to control the way this is happening. Sit and hang and be in that space and actually pay attention to the 10 to 20% that you do have in common. Start there as a building point, and then become aware of the 70 to 80% where you feel disrupted, and spend time with people in your spiritual community to process that disruption and that discomfort, and get really good at how to be in space with people across difference who are doing things that the way you would not do them or have different ways of seeing the world than you do, and get really good at learning how to be in that community without needing to dominate that community or turn that community in a way that reflects you. I think the challenge we have in America is that we have a country that is based on colonialism, that says that the only way that you get into the circle of human concern is if I can convert you to become me. So we look at what happened to the indigenous relatives here. We came in, become Christian, dress like us, wear your hair like us. That's how you get to be in the circle of human concern. And if we're not careful, even as Christians, we can do the same thing, because sometimes part of our faith is, well, the only way that you get into God's circle of human concern is to accept Christ. If you don't accept Christ, then you're outside the circle of human concern. And so I think we have to figure out how to decolonize our Christian faith. We need to decolonize what it means for us to be in this, United States of America. And I think a big invitation is get into those practices. I encourage people, read a book, yes. Watch a movie, great places for awareness. The big shift for practices is start showing up in places. So show up at meetings, show up in actions, protests, marches, show up in places of service, but show up as a learner, wait for an invitation to lead if an invitation ever comes.
Right.
It may never come. Which is also good because we don't always have to be the leader. We can be a learner. We can be a follower. Hey, Amy, I kept looking. I was like, that's Amy. Hey, sorry, we haven't seen each other in years for Project Peace. I kept going, she's familiar. Amy, I haven't seen you in a long time for Project Peace. But sorry about that. We'll say hi after. Show up, and we need to be learners, not always having to find a way to be leaders. If we'll lean into those practices, so I just invite you to always find a practice that makes you sweat a little bit. Find that practice. The thing that I want to push people away from is don't hang out in the choir. What I mean by that is you only find places where people agree with you. That does not form you. Mm-hmm. That's where you find comfort. What forms you is the agitation. When you put something in the washing machine, what makes the dirt come out is the agitation. So we need that agitation. We need that disruption. But I think we need to learn that the disruption and the agitation is actually working the othering out of me. When I get called in, and I've been called in over the years, I've had, there was a young brother here in East Oakland. We were doing the violence prevention work, and he told me, I was like, you got to put the gun down. And we went downstairs, and he was outside, and he told me, he said, so you want me to put the gun down, right? And I said, yeah. He said, okay. So while we were at the meeting, I opened up my phone. I saw you on Facebook. He said, I saw you cupcaking with your wife. Cupcaking, that's another word to look up, right? But it just means hanging out, right, and being close, right? He said, I saw you cupcaking with your wife on Facebook. He said, so let me tell you something. On my block in East Oakland, he was like, I'm the one that's carrying what he said. He called it the hammer, which means the gun, right? He said, I'm the one that's got the hammer on me. He said, because I have the hammer on me, people that are around me on my block, they feel safe because I got the hammer on me, right? He said, so you think that because I came to this meeting with you, that all of the challenges I've been dealing with in Oakland is just going to go away because they said, oh, you're doing ceasefire now, so all of that's going to go away? He said, no, people still going to be shooting me. He said, I'm on parole, which means I can't stay at the housing authority place because I'm on paperwork. So my sister is there, and I can't stay there. And he said, y'all won't let me smoke weed because then I have to take my urine test, and that's going to violate me to go back to prison. He was like, so I'm driving around in my car with 100 rounds every day. I sneak into my sister's house at night, and I sneak out in the morning before the housing authority police comes around so that I can find a way to be safe. So when you tell me to put the gun down, and I'm looking at you cupcaking with your wife, he said, am I coming to your house to sleep? He said, are y'all going to invite me over for the holidays?
Right.
And he said, so until you're willing to answer those questions for me, he said, me and you don't really have anything to talk about. Are you asking me to put the gun down for me, or are you asking me to put the gun down for you? And until you're ready to help me put the gun down for me and you don't have nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
That agitation gave me a whole new perspective around public safety.
Yep.
Because the way that I was thinking about it was from my world. And I didn't even understand his world. But when he brought me into his world, I was like, okay, yeah, why don't you keep that gun on you until I get until I get some better answers, because right now I'm saying you be less safe so that I can feel more safe. And we don't get to belonging until I'm actually making sure that we both feel safe.
Like, God bless, what an expansive, permeable human being you are, right? Like, that's why I have hope for the world, is because you are willing to sit there, not only be in that room, but sit there in the conversation and hear that and be like, yep, okay, you told me. Why has it become so existential? I mean, we're seeing this in our modern politics and civic engagement. To be called out, it feels like the end of the world. What is that?
I'm to quote Janelle. Janelle, we talk about this often. Janelle always says, she says, it's pride. It's pride. We're in a world right now where a lot of us wrestle with wanting to have the right answer, and being confronted with an experience that suggests we don't have the answer causes us to freak out.
Yeah.
And I have found that by being in proximity of people across difference more often doesn't get rid of that discomfort, but it lowers it from a 10 to maybe a 5.
Yeah, okay.
And so I still hate it when I get called out. My first reaction is still, do you know what for example, we were doing the pre-sale book tour in Portland. So I got to Portland, I'm feeling good, got my little shiny suit on, I'm feeling good about myself, right? And we're doing the presentation, and in the middle of the presentation, one of the sisters there from Portland started interrupting me because she felt like I was centering white people in my story because I had a little slide deck that I was showing. And we went through this whole scenario, and let me tell you, I was mortified internally while it was happening, because I was, and I immediately wanted to go to defending myself.
Yeah.
Like, let me show you all the stuff that I've done.
Yeah.
Do you know that I went, I wanted to, pull out all my jail receipts and, like, you don't know me, But what I had to realize in that moment was that, and I called Janelle whining about it, and she was like, she better be lucky I wasn't there. I was coming on, There's my big defender over here, even though she's a foot shorter than me, right? But the more that I sat with that, she did help me, because that experience changed the way that I talked about some of this.
Yeah.
It gave me a lens that I didn't have at that time. So it didn't feel good, but I also have learned that it didn't have to destroy me.
Yeah.
And that every encounter with each other doesn't need to be a zero-sum experience.
Yes.
That either went all the way well, or it was just horrible, I'm never doing that again. So it's kind of, to me, like building muscle.
Yeah.
If you run into a gym and you immediately jump to the bench that has 300 pounds, if you've not been there, it's not going to work out too great.
No.
Right? But if you start with those 5, 10-pound dumbbells, it'll get easier, and when mistakes happen and things feel heavier, we don't have to tap out.
Yeah. Yes, from personal experience, it's like realizing after that first time of being called out that you survive, and that actually it makes you a more aware person. You're like, okay, it can happen again, and I'm going to survive. But it's become heightened to a level where which is exactly why we stay in our choirs, right? And so you are calling us to build these muscles, not for the sake of our own strength, but for the sake of the beloved community.
Well, and learning how to be called out and called in from people you're in relationship with is also something we have to do. And when you were talking, I just thought about when we launched some of this belonging work in its current state about 5 years ago. We did it at the Oakland Hilton. So we had 300 people there. We're doing this whole experience. And as I'm moving too quickly, I was trying to do this exercise, and I said, I want all the black folks who identify as black come over here. All of the Latino folks come over here. All the white folks come over here. And, our Asian American folks, other folks, y'all can go over there. And when I got done, my Japanese sister, man, she came for me with some heat. And I was like, you my sister, like, And she was like, we always get called the others. We become the invisible people in this conversation about race. And I had to sit down there at the Hilton with somebody who I was in relationship with and listen to her call me in. Because she was like, with the level of influence that you have, when you disappear us, it has greater impact than when others do. And so now I've had to get into the practice where when I'm making anything, I send it to a Kimmy. I'm like, Kimmy, what am I missing? Because I recognize I had an instruction spot, and it's not going to disappear because I know I have it. So now I have to actually ask, Kimmy, help me. Am I telling the story in a way that you feel as an Asian American woman you're being seen? Help me, correct me. Like, these are the practices I think we could get into. That doesn't mean we change everything about us, but we learn how to change some smaller, accessible things so that we cause less harm in the world.
Well, I can tell that Kimmy's have shaped your work along
She did.
the way.
She signed off on it. I sent that to her.
Truly. Like, yes, thank you. You're, again, the generosity in which your work honors so many of us, no matter where we are in the work. And again, all these words fail the complexity of all of what we're trying to, the work, the thing, but what y'all are doing is just, it's so meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've already seen some people like starting to shoot some hands up. Jean, did you have a question, my dear Jean?
I'm familiar with just a little bit of what you did with the Oakland Police Department and the community, and how some of that all came unraveled at one time. And how did you practice self-care during that time when everything seems to crash around you?
She said, how did I practice
Care.
Self-care? Not well. I didn't do it well. I have more awareness around it now, but during that time, that was like 2016, not well. There was so much that was happening, and I was not telling people. I was beginning what I now know was a period of going into depression because of all of what was happening, but I didn't have the language to say it at that time, nor did I feel like I would be respected by saying that I was struggling to deal with that. I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed for having been in a relationship with this department and trying to get to certain goals, and to know that, a child was being sexually trafficked and raped behind closed doors. So I think over time, what I've learned is I had to adopt real practices, which was about slowing down, was centering joy, ensuring that therapy is a part of my normal practice, learning how to actually share the burden, of trying to do social change with other people.
Yeah.
One of the main practices has been allowing a group of people to help me actually make choices about what we say yes to and what we say no to. Because, some of us, we're so well-meaning, we'll just throw ourselves everything in, and sometimes you need somebody who's not in it to go, yeah, you've done enough. You should probably pause and take a break. And so, it was certainly, I just watched a part of the Force for another event that we were doing last week. And I told Janelle after when I left it, literally watching it, I feel like I had like a PTSD response in my body. And so I think it just taught me that when we really wade into the deep waters of what's wrong, we have to have community and a self-care plan connected to it. If not, I encourage people not to do that. When Dr. King, last piece I'll say on it, when Dr. King died and they did his autopsy, they said his heart was in the condition of a 70-year-old person.
Yeah, I believe it.
At 39 years old.
Yeah.
So if they hadn't killed him, he was going to die within 5 to 10 years from a massive heart attack.
Yeah.
That can't be the only way that we participate in trying to make this world better. So I have found that self-care has to happen. I actually write a chapter about it in the book, that radical self-care has to go alongside radical belonging.
Jean, thank you for asking that question, and thank you for being so transparent about mental health, because I do think in this work, what you were saying, what you're exposed to, you almost feel like you're not allowed to be like, who am I to be sad? Look at, who am I to be depressed? Who am I to be struggling? And so you bury, having done that myself, 100%, thank you for the question and for naming that. Okay, you guys need to use the mics, please. Thanks. Go ahead, Kim.
Ben, you, in your book, indicated that respect was the response that the young men that you were working with talked about their reason that they killed, respect. And when I read that, I realized I needed to have an expanded understanding of respect. And from, your words today, you can say being seen, being listened to, having some power, having some privilege. But if you would engage in a little deeper understanding of what they mean when respect as a motivation for killing perhaps someone that's sitting right next to them.
Yeah. Fantastic question. What I've learned over the course of time is what the young men have meant when they say respect is that they want safety, and they want to have the power to make themselves safe from threats from others. But it is primarily about power and agency. And what I learned was that the young men felt so unsafe in the communities that they grew up in because the adults failed to make them safe. A lot because of the conditions that caused the adults to not have agency. And so the young men, their world felt like anybody who disrespected me would make me vulnerable to violence. So I have to either be prey or predator because it's that cut and dry. And one of the other things that I learned was that a lot of the young men, particularly when I started the violence work a decade ago, a lot of them lived in 8-block radiuses. They didn't leave outside of 8, maybe 12 blocks. So the world for them was very small. I met people who lived in East Oakland who had never been to San Francisco. The furthest that they had been was Lake Merritt. So living in that small of a world where you're proximate to people who either are going to make you prey or predator will cause certain people to say, I'm going to take the choice of predator. I can't afford to be vulnerable. And so what I started realizing was that in order to empower them to make different choices, it wasn't just about giving them a job, because that didn't actually deal with the respect and vulnerability issue. It was about giving them belonging, community, family, relationships, and being a place and getting other people to be places where they could call and process that vulnerability that they were feeling. And I remember one quick story. I was down in Oakland, just came to mind, with a brother who had just been shot. He lifted up his shirt to me, had been shot the week before, had this horrible scar on his side. And I said, so what's happening for you? He said, I'm getting ready to go kill the person that did this to me. And I said, okay. And he went on and on and on. And I remember asking him a different question than I'd been asking. I said, what could I do, or what could be done that would make it less likely that you would kill this person? And he said, well, if I don't feel like he can shoot me again, then that would do something. And then I realized, okay, we got to relocate this brother.
Yeah.
And so it was less about, let me change your mind around why you shouldn't choose violence. That wasn't the solution. The solution was we needed to give him a place where he didn't feel as vulnerable. So vulnerability around safety, I found, if we really want to do something, I look at how the violence now has come back. You know, we were able to cut the violence by 50% over 5 years, and now the violence is coming back, and people are like, oh, we just need more jobs, or we need such and such. No, we need to address the issues of vulnerability that people are feeling, and if we do that, and it's not just jobs, we need that. It's not just housing, we need that, but we need people who are willing to be in relationship with people who feel vulnerable. If we can get people, then I think we can get to safety.
Yeah, amen. Okay, folks, I really want to give y'all an opportunity to get your book signed by Ben. And okay, I just because I've been like deep dive on all things Ben McBride lately, there are some really rich conversations. One particularly with Mark Laberton on his podcast with Ben that kind of just delve into a lot of the questions I'm sure that you all might have. And then the book. Any other resources you want to point folks to?
Yeah, I would just say, benmcbride.com, there's some stuff on there. And then the organization that Janelle and I lead, fosteringbelonging.org. There are also some resources where we're doing this work. Because sometimes we find like people are like, okay, I got this, but how do I make this real in a place where I work, in a place where, you know, I'm doing community work? So benmcbride.com or fosteringbelonging.org are two places where people can find some next steps.
Okay, and since I have like 100 or so witnesses here, will you come back?
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
You heard
Absolutely.
it. It's going to be on YouTube. It's now in contract. Folks, let's give it up for Ben McBride.
Thank you.
Get your copy. I mean it. Life-changing. Get your copy. And we'll be signing books outside in the patio, from patio. Awesome. Okay.